So thank you, Ms. Glaser, for taking our interview. And first, I want to start with asking your thoughts on Xi Jinping's recent speech where he mentioned a peaceful reunification with Taiwan. Because previously in his other speeches, he mentioned that the Taiwan issue could not be passed down from generation to generation. And he said, like, any attempts that stands in the way will be smashed. So what do you make of his recent speech? And do you think his Taiwan policy has changed?
So I don't think that Xi Jinping's policy has changed. This is not the first time that Xi Jinping has said that there should be peaceful reunification. In fact, if you read all of the statements and speeches that Xi Jinping has made, they've been fairly consistent. There has been some indication of impatience, such as his statements that the Taiwan problem should not be passed down from generation to generation. He has now said that twice since coming to power. But he inherited the policy guideline from Hu Jintao of peaceful development across the Taiwan Strait. And in his January 2019 speech, he reaffirmed that. So ultimately, Xi Jinping's policy is one of preferring to achieve unification peacefully, while of course not ruling out use of force and not ruling out coercive measures either. So I actually see Xi Jinping's statements as quite consistent. He continues to say that this is a historical inevitability, that Taiwan must return to the control of the motherland. He doesn't rule out use of force. And he continues to say peaceful unification is the goal.
But despite of him reiterating the word peaceful, there's increasingly more Chinese military jets flying over the Taiwan Strait. And the speculation of a war breaking out is also increasing. Do you think a war is likely to break out?
Well, again, I don't think that Xi Jinping has ruled out use of force, and I think that everybody should not rule out the possibility of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. That said, I do not think that such an attack is likely, and the policies pursued by Taiwan and by the United States will affect Xi Jinping's decision-making. Also, the policies of other countries who express concern about what is happening in the Taiwan Strait, China's military coercion against Taiwan in particular. In my view, the potential for war is not very high. The operations taking place in Taiwan's air defense identification zone are intended to bully and intimidate Taiwan. They are intended to stress the pilots in Taiwan and the maintenance crews and to test Taiwan's defenses overall and to warn Taiwan and the United States not to go too far to cross Chinese red lines. They're also intended to train PLA pilots. And Xi Jinping, indeed, has called for more realistic training. But I don't think that an increase in the number of aircraft in Taiwan's air defense identification zone is a signal that China is about to attack Taiwan.
So what do you think is China's calculation now? What is stopping them from an invasion?
Well, first of all, as I said, China's interests are best served by convincing Taiwan that there is a better life for the people in integrating with a rising China. The goal of Xi Jinping, I think, is to induce a sense of psychological despair in the minds of Taiwanese people that they only really have a bright future if they join with the motherland. So this is part of psychological warfare that has been going on against Taiwan for many, many years. But I would also say that if Xi Jinping is to contemplate use of force, he has to think about what the risks are for him. And the risks begin with a failed invasion. And I think that could have a negative impact on the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and also perhaps of Xi Jinping's position in particular. And I also think that it would have a potentially negative impact on Xi Jinping globally having used force against Taiwan. Really, it would be the first major use of force by China since 1979. And I think other countries would fear that Beijing is now emboldened to use force to solve other problems. There's also the risk of a major war with the United States. I think that the PLA assumes that the U.S. military would get involved in such a war to defend Taiwan. And therefore, if China were to go to war with the United States, there is the potential for escalation to nuclear weapons, a much wider war that may not be limited just to the Taiwan Strait. And it, of course, would then pose questions about whether Xi Jinping would be able to achieve all the other objectives that he has set out for China for 2035 and 2049, including the attainment of the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. After all, if they end up in a major war with the United States, I think that would just undermine Xi Jinping's other objectives. So it's very noteworthy that when Xi Jinping made a speech just a couple of weeks ago to mark the 110th anniversary of the Xinhai Revolution in 1911, he said China needs a stable domestic and international environment for national rejuvenation. And I think that that is an important statement. And so I think that at least for the next few years, the United States and Taiwan have a window to strengthen the measures that they are taking to continue to deter a Chinese attack on Taiwan.
Then how do you evaluate Biden's Taiwan policy? Because against this backdrop of a more competitive China and a more tense U.S.-China relationship, do you think this strategic ambiguity is still valid?
Well, strategic ambiguity only refers to the question of whether or not the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan. And I believe that it is still valid. The White House continues to say that that is U.S. policy. There are risks to moving toward a position of strategic clarity, of saying, regardless of the circumstances, the United States will come to Taiwan's defense. And one of those risks is that Beijing could conclude that the United States has essentially violated the terms of normalization that took place in 1979, which included ending the mutual defense treaty with Taiwan, under which the United States did have an obligation to come to Taiwan's defense. And if Xi Jinping is backed into a corner, I would say this is particularly relevant in the run-up to the 20th Party Congress, where a year from now he will get a third 5-year term in office. Xi Jinping could be compelled, really forced to use force against Taiwan, because otherwise he might be seen as weak and not defending his country's territorial integrity and sovereignty. So I think already we have heard senior Biden administration officials say that there are inherent risks in changing the policy of strategic ambiguity, and I don't expect it will happen in this administration.
Okay, as you mentioned previously that it is not to China's interest and they would avoid a war because the U.S. force might get involved. But do you think it's to U.S. interest to get involved in this war to defend Taiwan? Do you think the Biden administration would defend Taiwan if the war was going to break out?
Well, I personally believe that Taiwan matters greatly to the United States. It is a vibrant democracy of 23.5 million people. We have, of course, a long, close history with the people of Taiwan. Taiwan stands as an alternative model to the People's Republic of China to show that that governance, a very high quality system of governance, can be led by people with ethnic Chinese backgrounds. Often the Chinese say that they are a better democracy, but I think that in fact Taiwan is. But I would also make the point that President Biden himself, in speaking at a town hall just a few days ago, when asked if he would defend Taiwan, said yes. He later said that the United States actually has a commitment to come to Taiwan's defense. And that is not completely accurate, since the Taiwan Relations Act does not compel the United States to come to Taiwan's defense. But I think that it tells us something about President Biden's own personal feelings about this issue. And I think he feels very strongly that we must deter an attack from China on Taiwan.
Very well. So my last question is about Xi Jinping and China's sixth plenum. So 5 years ago, when Xi Jinping took power, you made some comments on him. You mentioned that Xi was an exceptionally strong leader, and you said that China would be more assertive in defending its own interests in the world. Now that 5 years have passed, do you have any updates to add?
Well, I think we have seen a pattern of growing assertiveness and even aggression in Chinese foreign policy. And this is particularly true, of course, on territorial disputes. We have seen China use small-scale use of force on the Indian border, for example, and where about, I think, 20 or so Indians lost their lives. We have seen China double down on the use of coercion with its paramilitary forces in the South China Sea, for example. And then we've seen the emergence of wolf warrior diplomacy in China over the last few years, particularly as the world has tried to investigate the origins of the COVID-19 virus. And I think this has been viewed by Beijing as threatening to the legitimacy of Chinese Communist Party rule in China. So I think that in the coming year, we may see a bit of a tactical shift in Chinese foreign policies in the run-up to the 20th Party Congress. But my own expectation is that after Xi Jinping gets his third 5-year term in office, that we are likely to see even greater Chinese assertiveness and coercion against other countries, against its neighbors, but also against countries in Europe, where we've seen greater willingness to put some pressure on them, and also, of course, tension with the United States. So I think that this trend line is going to continue going forward.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Glaser, for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you.